Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Peter Hurst, Senior Associate Dean for Executive Education at MIT Sloan School of Management, and we're thrilled that you're joining us from all over the world for the latest in our Innovation Network webinar series. This is our deep dive format, so we've got 60 minutes to really get to grips with today's topic, which is improving organizational processes with dynamic work design. And I am thrilled today to be joined by my colleague, Professor Nelson Repenning, who is the School of Management Distinguished Professor of System Dynamics and Organization Studies at the MIT Sloan School, and also has literally in the last few days just finished a stint as the Associate Dean of Leadership and Special Projects on our leadership team at the Sloan School as well. Nelson is really an important contributor to our work in executive education. He's been a leader and an award-winning instructor and faculty member in all of his teaching activities, but especially from our point of view in executive education, where he has applied his research and his experience of teaching executives to really helping many companies and many executives to understand the principles and practices, if I may put it that way, of how to apply operating tools and management systems in ways that actually work for companies and organizations. And I'm sure we'll be learning more about that in the coming minutes. Nelson also has a book coming out, hopefully maybe in the next year or so. Current working title, There's Got to Be a Better Way. But in the meantime, here's a real preview for everyone that's tuned in today of what will be in that book. So you can't get it anywhere other than from Nelson in this webinar and in the courses that he teaches in executive education. So we're very pleased that you're all here with us. Again, good to see such a global audience. And we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions after Nelson has made some opening remarks. But what we are going to cover is what is dynamic work design and how to get started with it, and think about whether it is something that you will be able to use in your organization. And not to steal any of Nelson's thunder, but I can guarantee you that it is. The answer to that is yes. What we will also have in a very classic way from Professor Repenning is some advice on how to avoid some common impediments and pitfalls that others have experienced in trying to apply these kinds of models and these kinds of techniques in their work. And in particular, as I mentioned earlier, Nelson has a role in thinking about leadership for the Sloan School. And so he will share with us some of the best practices that he has discovered and created for cultivating cultures in which dynamic work design as an approach actually can not only be successful, but truly flourish. So with that, let me hand over to Nelson. I will mute for a little while, but I will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. As Elaine mentioned, please feel free to put any questions that you have as they occur to you in the Q&A, and I will come back and help Nelson sift through those and answer some of your questions. So with that, Nelson, if I may hand the mic over to you, and please take it away.
All right, fabulous. Thank you, Peter. Good day, everyone. It's really a pleasure to see you all, and thank you so much for taking your time out of your busy days to join us. So as Peter alluded to, I'm an MIT lifer. I have been here essentially my entire adult life, which is now more than 30 years. And the problem that I've worked on in a variety of ways, which you'll get a little taste of here, really boils down to the nuts and bolts of how do we make your organizations work better. And where this started is I actually started out studying organizational change and organizational change initiatives. And the thing that I really focused on was this kind of cartoon of when large organizations try to change, they print up T-shirts and they have coffee mugs and they have offsites and everyone gets all excited. You need to sign your names to posters and so on and so forth. And yet, when you would go do sort of careful follow-up studies, it turned out that that approach to change rarely, if ever, worked. So you might get a tote bag out of it or an extra coffee mug for your cupboard, but it didn't really have a material impact on how the organization operated. And so from there, I've been trying to think, hard and thoughtfully and carefully about what set of tools can we give you in business schools so that if you want to make your organization work better, you can go back and actually do that. And the product of that, from now 30 years of research with lots of valued colleagues and thousands of students that have participated along the way, is this thing that we call dynamic work design. And I want to give you a little taste of what that is today. And so the way I want to structure my remarks, and as Peter said, I'll try to leave some time for questions, is I want to give you the big idea, kind of the essence of what this dynamic work design thing is. It's a little bit different than maybe you thought about it before. We're going to do a deep dive into one facet of dynamic work design. And you get obviously a lot more of this if you take some time to join our courses. So I want to talk a little bit about one facet of it, which is how do you think about overloading your organization. It's something that organizations do all the time. It has lots of very negative consequences. And if you can learn to manage the amount of work that you put in your organization a little bit more effectively, it has a lot of desirable properties. So we'll talk about that a little bit. I'm going to show you a case study. And then I want to leave you with one trick that you could literally use this afternoon or tomorrow that we've had incredibly good luck with, that hopefully you can help make your meetings and your organizations run better right away. And hopefully this is also, a little bit of a teaser for our class, which, we'll try to kind of match the format of what it'll be like a little bit to sit in our classroom. Okay? So here is the big idea, 30 years of work into half of a sentence here, which is what all my work suggests is that many of the most frustrating aspects you have in your organizations, whether it's too many emails or too many meetings or stuff that doesn't get done, or projects that are always late and so on and so forth, boils down to the following idea, right? Which is that when you try to impose a static solution on a dynamic problem, you're going to get yourself into trouble. Okay? Now, that probably sounds a little jargony and may not make sense. So let me give you an analogy that I think will really, I would hope will clarify this. What do I mean when I say that we often try to impose static solutions on dynamic problems? So here's the analogy or the metaphor. Which is I want you to take a look at the two things on the screen. And most of you probably are familiar with both of them. The thing on the left is an early in-car GPS system from the early 2000s. Many of you probably owned one of these at one point. Garmin was a big provider. There was one by TomTom, and you may remember it had the suction cup on the bottom, and you stuck it on your dashboard, and then actually went in, the power source was the cigarette lighter back when we had cigarette lighters in cars. And then fast forward, the screenshot on the right is from my phone, which is the Waze app, which, all of you probably have some, if you're a regular driver, some kind of traffic app on your phone. And the thing that I want to highlight is how differently these two things work. So if you remember how those early GPS systems work, so again, early 2000s, right? If you were going from Boston to New York, right, you would type in the destination that you wanted. So, we want to go to New York City. It would use a very sophisticated algorithm and map, and it would plot a route from city A to city B, okay? And off you would go, okay? But as you know, right, the world of traffic is a changing world, or to use our jargon today, a dynamic world. And the early systems were not capable of reacting to any of the changes that might happen on the way. So if you've ever done that route, it's actually got lots of traffic, and you've got to go through Hartford and so on and so forth. So if there was a traffic jam in an intermediate city, the early systems would do nothing about that, and it would route you right into it. Okay? Now, how could we fix that, right? Well, if you think about that problem for a second, you could imagine a bunch of different rules that you could have put into those early systems that might have helped, right? So there happens to be a city in between Boston and New York, Hartford, Connecticut. Some of you have probably been there, right? And we know that at rush hour, the traffic's going to be worse, right? So we could update that system and say, well, if you happen to be driving through the city at rush hour, right, maybe we should take a different route and go around it. Okay? But the problem is that with each of those rules, which are static, right, they're still not reacting to the changing world. Anytime you put a rule in place, you almost always have to add another rule, right? So if you think about, we decide to route you around the city at rush hour. Well, rush hour is only true on workdays and when we don't have a holiday. So then I would have to go add another rule, which is don't apply the first rule on weekends or on holidays, right? And then you could imagine we could add other rules for sporting events and road construction, but then each of one of those would require a follow-on rule and so on and so forth, okay? And you could imagine that the system could get enormously complicated with a zillion different rules to try to compensate for a changing world. And none of them would be perfect because you can't predict traffic accidents or weather or anything like that. Okay. The reason for this analogy is that I want to argue that that's approximately what most of your organizations are doing today, okay? Which is that you are making static plans, right? We're going to have a strategy for this year. We're going to have a budget for this year. But most of you, probably all of you, your organizations live in very rapidly changing complex environments. And the static plan that you make for your budget or your strategy for that year is never going to accommodate all the kind of hiccups and changes and new technologies and market moves that are going to happen during the course of the year. And so what you try to do is then you layer rule on top of rule to try to accommodate for that dynamic world, but it doesn't really work, right? And in fact, as I said, most of the frustrations that you probably have about ridiculous budget processes or meetings that take too long or project review meetings or whatever it might be are the consequence of that kind of thicket of rules that we have applied on top of our existing structures in order to accommodate for a dynamic world, but it never really works, right? So what do we want? Well, let's go back to the traffic analogy. What I have on the right there is, as I said, a screenshot from the Waze app, right? And all modern traffic apps now work this way, right? Rather than trying to forecast in advance every eventuality that might change your path from Boston to New York, what does Waze do, right? Well, it gets real-time updates from the other drivers, very clever, and it will dynamically update your path as you go, right? So if there's a traffic jam in Hartford, right, it'll tell you that, and it will redo the route and route you around it, right? And the basic idea of dynamic work design is we want to give you a set of tools and strategies so that you can start to make your organization look a little bit more like the Waze app and a little bit less like the early GPS systems, right? Which is I want to put you in a place where you are in a better able to react to the changing world, to use real-time information to make adjustments, rather than creating this kind of, thicket of rules, one on top of each other. Okay? So to see what that means for you all to go out of the traffic, let's do just a tiny little exercise. So what I want everyone to do is in the chat, is I want you to type, how long, I want you to type the answer to the following question, which is how long is your budget season? And what I mean by that is, let's imagine your budget goes in place on, say, January 1 or July 1. How many months in your home companies do you start planning for that budget before it goes into effect? So just type the number in the chat. How long does it take? How long is your budget season? So I see 6, 4, 5, 3, 12, 2. Well, 2 is pretty good. Okay. Right, great. And we can keep going with that, right? Everyone sees it somewhere between sort of 3 and 6 months, maybe as much as 12, okay? Now, here's question number 2. Same thing, you just have to type one number into the chat. Once that budget goes into effect, right? So we've gotten to July 1 or January 1 or whatever it is. How long are the assumptions in that budget relevant before you have to work around them, right? So how long can you work off that budget before the world changes and you have to do something else? Okay, right? So you see the exact point of this, right? Somewhere between 2 and 3 for most of you, right? And I run this exercise all the time with my students. And I would say, this is not research, it's just my anecdotal experience. The average answer to the first question is about 6 months, right? People start planning for their next year's budget about 6 months in advance. And the average answer to the second question is about 3 months, right? So what that means, if you think about it for a second, right, is that we tend to spend twice as much time making the budget as actually using it, right? And this is just one example of what happens when you try to take a static approach to a fundamentally dynamic world, right? We invest an enormous amount of time in planning, right? For many of you, it's probably a fairly excruciating process of multiple meetings and submissions and so on and so forth to get that perfect budget. And there's a lot of negotiation that happens with your boss. But when push comes to shove and the year actually starts, maybe we can use that budget for a quarter before it becomes something that we need to work around, right? It becomes a constraint on your activity, okay? And this is kind of the essential idea of dynamic work design, right? We're not going to get rid of budgets. We're not going to get rid of static structures. Those things are important. But if we could complement those with a different set of structures that would allow us to react a little bit more nimbly to how the world works, we might get better performance. And I'm going to try to show you in the rest of the talk that that is in fact the case, that if you take this more dynamic perspective, there are in fact many, many opportunities to make your organizations work better in a fairly straightforward fashion. Okay? So what I want to do now, as I said, is give you a taste of one of the core ideas of dynamic work design. There are, in fact, 5 principles that we cover when we take the class. And if I ever get this book done, will be detailed in the book. We can talk about how that's going offline. But one of the sort of core principles, the one that we're going to talk about today, is what we call optimal challenge. Okay, and the basic idea here is that if we want an organization that in fact is capable of reacting to changing conditions, one of the key precursors to that turns out to be making sure that we have the right amount of work in the system. And you probably all understand this intuitively. It turns out, and I'll show you a little evidence of this in just a moment, that most organizations take on too much. They bite off more than they can chew, right? So we have too many projects, our objectives are too high, too much work that we're trying to do. And the consequence of that is that overloading an organization makes it much less agile or much less nimble. So if you overload your organization, your ability to redirect or change when the world changes tends to go down. In some sense, if you want another metaphor, overload tends to kind of harden the organizational arteries, right? So learning to manage that workload to what we call optimal challenge, and I'll explain where that comes from in a moment, turns out to be a really key precursor to creating a more adaptable organization. And in fact, what my research tends to show, and I'll show you an example in a moment, is that when you get this right, particularly if your organization is chronically overloaded, the gains you get in performance are substantial, and in fact so large that when I have participated in interventions, when I see the results as an academic, I kind of squint at them like, I can't believe the numbers are in fact this big. But I've seen it happen enough times that I now do have some confidence that if you can learn to get the workload roughly matched to your capacity in your organizations, particularly in knowledge work, the gains can be enormous. Okay, so let me dig into this a little bit, and then I'm going to show you an example of it in action. Okay? Very quickly, just in terms of the scholarship, the sort of foundation of the manage optimal challenge principle is something that is in psychology. It's known as the YatesDodson Curve. And the basic idea, this was documented at the turn of the last century, is that if you look at how humans and other animals perform under stress, it turns out, no big surprise, this hopefully is fairly intuitive, is there's an optimal amount of stress. And so you get this kind of inverted U-shaped curve between the amount of stress we experience and how well we perform, right? So if you think about your own lives, if I'm not feeling very stressed, then I don't work that hard, I don't perform that well. As stress goes up, maybe my boss sends me an email or I set a higher target, my performance get better. But the key part of the YatesDodson curve is it also has this downward sloping portion. And it's very clear for humans and organizations, if I put you under too much stress, right, then your performance actually starts to decline. And there's multiple reasons for that, but just to give you one, this is a vast literature, is that as you experience lots of stress, your body produces physical symptoms that you're all familiar with. My hands get clammy, my heart starts to beat, I start to sweat. And the experience of those physical symptoms actually can occupy some scarce cognitive space. So, if I'm giving a talk and I'm bombing, right, I start to think about how much I'm sweating or how poorly I'm doing rather than what I'm going to say next, which of course then makes the talk even worse. Right? So the basic organizational principle here is going to be for the company or the product team or your sales team or whatever, how do I get that stress level kind of sort of roughly at the peak of that curve so that people are working hard, but I'm not pushing them into the pathology. Okay? Well, it turns out lots of organizations do not do this well. And as I said, there have been a variety of costs associated with overload, meaning that if you put too much work into your organization, your performance tends to go down. And there's several reasons for this, but there's 3 big ones. Number one, which is that when people have too much to do, there is an overhead cost, as I'm sure you're all familiar with task switching, right? So if I have 6 different projects I'm working on and I work on 1 and then I work on 2 and I work on 3, each time I switch from one project to the next, right, I have to put the old one down. I have to think about what I'm doing, remember that project, do my work, and then move on, right? And there's some data, I'm not sure I'd bet my retirement funds that, particularly for R&D organizations, the the performance is optimized when we have, maybe 2 or 3 projects per engineer, right? Any more than that, and then it starts to become too expensive because, again, of that overhead cost of switching from one task to the next. Okay? Second cost of overload is one I've spent a good chunk of my career documenting, and we have some papers on this, but when people have too much work to do, it tends to cause them to change how they allocate their attention. And basically, it tends to focus them more on short-term kind of quick fixes, and they invest less in long-run investments. So, they'll focus on making the next sales call, making the next sale, or getting the next product out the door, but not investing in the sales pipeline or in underlying capabilities that we need to develop in new products. And that can push you into this thing that we call the capability trap, where overload can cause you to degrade the overall capability of your organization. This is basically almost always the reason when we have a major industrial accident, is there's been too much work in the system and people have changed their work in what turns out to be pathological ways. Okay? And then the third cost of overload is one that I'm sure you're all intimately familiar with, which is that overloaded systems tend to just be less robust to variation, right? So if you ever tried to leave a city on Friday afternoon, right, once the highway is fully jammed with cars, right, it grinds to a halt. And it turns out the reason for that is that when a system is overloaded, any minor variation in how long it takes someone to make a move or drive or whatever just erodes the overall performance of the system. This is the same reason that you never want the last doctor's appointment or dentist appointment of the day, which is all those little variations sort of add up. Okay? So suffice to say, it turns out to be enormously expensive to put too much work into your organization. It degrades performance in lots of very material ways. And as I said, it reduces adaptability. But it also turns out to be ubiquitous. This is something that almost all organizations do. I don't know how many companies I've worked with in my life. I'm sure it's now in the dozens. And I don't think I've ever come across one that didn't have some facet of this particular problem. So what do you do about it? Okay? How can we fix this? And so what I want to do now is I want to tell you a little story about an organization that confronted this using some of the dynamic work design ideas. And any of you have seen me talk about this before. This is one of my go-to examples, so I apologize for the repetition, but I think it's quite powerful in this context. So in the development of dynamic work design, one of our lead users has been the Broad Institute. They're right across the street from us at MIT. You may have heard of them. It is the scientific institute that grew out of the Human Genome Project. So most of you are probably familiar with the Human Genome Project. Was this enormous scientific endeavor to map the first human genome. And what actually that technology did is it has not so slowly been ushering in an entirely new era of medicine, where increasingly the therapies that we get are going to be dictated by our unique gene sequence. And the Broad Institute has, following the Genome Project, been the industry leader in developing these technologies and bringing it to the medical world in usable fashions. And the group there that we have been working with for now more than a decade runs the lab that actually does the sequencing, right? So basically what will happen is a doctor or a researcher will bring a set of samples to the lab, could be blood or tissue or whatever, and the lab's job is to analyze them, identify the unique gene sequences for each of the individual, and provide that data back to the doctor or the researcher, right? So you can think of it as a factory where samples come in and data comes out the other side. Okay? When we first met the team in 2012, several of their leadership there were former students of mine. If you were a doctor or researcher that showed up with the sample and handed it to them and requested that they do the analysis, right, it would take them about 120 days from when the sample showed up to when you would get your data back. Okay? At the time, it turned out that a lot of other labs were getting in the gene sequencing game and could do it faster, so their demand was actually declining. And perhaps most problematic is that if you look at the process of gene sequencing, there's a bunch of chemical manipulations that happen, but the main event is the sample goes on this very sophisticated instrument that essentially sort of shoots lasers at the sample from different angles, takes photos, and then pieces those photos together to identify the gene sequence. The technology is changing so rapidly right now that they turn over all those machines about every 12 to 24 months. And at Broad at the time, they had about $50 million worth of these things, right? So imagine a plant where you have $50 million worth of capital and you only get to use it, for maybe a year or two. And then basically they go out in the dumpster and you have to get all new ones. Well, as you can see from the last graph, despite the fact that their process was slow and the equipment was very expensive, they never seemed to be able to get the utilization on those machines to higher than 50%, right? So if you have a big expensive piece of equipment, you want to use it, you can't get the utilization over 50%, something's going horribly wrong, right? And just to give you a flavor of what the lab felt like at that point, the samples have to be refrigerated to keep them useful. And at the time when my colleague Don Kiefer and I would sort of go visit them, there were just samples everywhere. The lab was just full of stuff. That's what's in those little plastic boxes. And if you ask them, where are the samples for the latest diabetes study, it sometimes could take them 2 days of rooting through those refrigerators to find your sample and process it, right? So it was just kind of a big, big mess. Okay? So how did they get in that mess and what do we do about it? Well, one of the sort of core elements of dynamic work design is we have appropriated a technique that is widely used in manufacturing and adapted it to the world of knowledge work with, I'll hope you show you in a moment, some success. And basically the idea is one of the core elements of dynamic work design is to try to use what in manufacturing would be used as a pull method of scheduling production rather than a push method, right? And I want to contrast these two because I think once you see the nuts and bolts, you'll get a sort of core idea about how to make this work. So if you think about the little picture here, when we first met the folks at Broad, they used what in manufacturing lingo would be known as a push method for scheduling production, right? Which basically meant that samples would show up. Think of each of those little gray boxes as a sample. It would immediately be pushed into the production process where it would sit in a pile and wait. At some point, a technician would come to the pile. They would take the top box off the pile. They would do whatever they were supposed to do, some kind of chemical manipulation or samples prep. Then they would move it to the next step in the process where they would wait. It would wait in a pile till that technician came and grabbed the box and so on and so forth, right? So each sample would have to sit in all of those piles and be pushed until it finally got to the gene sequencer, which was the last step in the process, okay? Now, very importantly, right? And this is sort of the key message here, is I want you to think about just for a second, in knowledge work, so the work that probably the majority of you do, where do those piles of work in process exist, right? Because it turns out almost all knowledge work processes are in fact managed using this sort of push style approach, right? And I'll just answer the question for you, but I'm sure you all know the answer, which is for most people and most organizations, those piles are in your email inboxes, right? So if you think about how most knowledge work is done, right? I do my part, right? I'd be filling out a spreadsheet or doing a piece of analysis or making some slides, right? I then email it to Peter, right? And it sits in Peter's email inbox until he gets around to doing his part. He does his part, and then he sends it along to the next person until it's complete, right? So the overwhelming majority of knowledge work is managed exactly in this push style, meaning I do my part and I push it to the next person, they do their part, and so on and so forth. But it turns out that push methods have 3 really big problems as a method of sort of managing and scheduling work. And you combine those 3 problems and you're pretty much guaranteed of getting a system that is overloaded, as we talked about before, and as a consequence, inflexible, right? Not able to adapt to changes in the world. And so here are the 3 problems, right? Number 1, push systems are slow. Right? So if you think about a sample or an email, if it has to sit in every one of those piles until it's done, it's going to take a long, long time to work its way through that particular process. But in fact, Peter and I have a colleague named John Little, who is the author of a very fundamental mathematical law that's called Little's Law, which basically says that the time required for any of those items to go through the process is proportional to the amount of work in process inventory, right? So the more stuff that's in the piles, the longer it's going to take, right? So anything that's got lots of work in process is by definition not responsive. Okay? Problem number 2 is I want you to think about for a second, this morning, when you first opened your computer and you looked at your email inbox or looked at your phone or whatever it might be, if you had more emails in your inbox than you had time to answer at that moment, what did you do? Right? Well, we all have slightly different rules, but what most people do is some version of the following, which is I scan all the messages I get. I try to identify the ones that are most important. I do those first and I save the rest for later, right? So in my case, it might be, did I get something from my boss? Okay, I'm gonna do those first. Did I get something from a co-author? And then maybe students, and then, other stuff maybe goes down the list, right? So what everybody does is they basically triage their own list and they try to prioritize. Right? And that's actually what was happening at Broad too, right? Each technician would look at the pile of samples they were supposed to work on, try to identify the ones that were most important, and then do those first. Okay? But the problem with that is that means that push systems are not only slow, but they're highly variable, right? Because each of us is imposing our own priority ordering on our to-do lists, and the way that I rank my tasks might be a little bit different than the way that Peter ranks his tasks. And so therefore it introduces an element of unpredictability, right? If it happens to be a task that we all think is important, great, it's going to go right through. But if I think it's important and Peter doesn't, it could sit in his inbox for days or weeks or whatever. And so then it becomes very hard to predict what was happening. And Broad had that problem big time, because not only was their process slow, but their variation in delivery times was also quite wide, right? Some things would go through fast, some things would go through slow, which then leads to the third biggest problem, which is think again about your own behavior, which is if you have a task that's so important, right, so important to your work that you don't want to risk it getting stuck in someone's email inbox or at the bottom of their to-do lists, what do you do, right? And the answer to that question, of course, is that you work around it, right? In factories, this would be called expediting. But essentially what you would do is you would find a way to hand carry that through the process to make sure that it got done, right? And we all have our own sort of basket of tricks that we do, right? How many of you have sent an email to someone and then texted the person right afterwards? Like, hey, Peter, text message, just want to know I sent you this email. It's really important, right? Or maybe you pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, Peter, it's Nelson. Just want you to know that I sent this email. Or sometimes Peter's executive staff will do this to me, right? How many times have you ambushed someone in the hallway or gone to their office just to remind them that the work you asked them to do is really important, right? All of these are sort of known as expediting. And essentially what you're doing is you're working around the process, right? You're trying to find some way to make sure that your particular task gets prioritized. Broad had their own version of this. If you were to go to the lab in the 2012s and you were to look at those piles of samples, some samples would have a piece of masking tape on them. And then in magic marker was written the letters FOE. And that stood for friend of Eric. And Eric in this case was Eric Lander, who was at the time the Broad's Institute director, right? And what FOE samples meant is the boss had called and said, this sample is really important. Can't you prioritize those? Okay. We all do it, right? We all expedite. We all try to move things through the process to essentially work around the process. But here's kind of the big idea, which is notice how expediting is very much a kind of vicious circle or self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because if I grab one of these samples, right, and basically push it to the top and prioritize it through the process, what I've done is I've made every other sample late, right? Because I've now destabilized the process. And so those researchers are eventually going to get irritated. They're going to call Eric and say, where's my sample? Then there's going to be another friend of Eric's sample. And before you know it, and this is sort of the key idea, expediting is the only way that work ever gets done, right? And if you think about your organizations, particularly for knowledge work, I'm guessing that's roughly how things work, which is there is a process through which work is supposed to be done. But in fact, there's so much work and it's so chaotic, the only way stuff ever gets done is when it's a kind of firefight, where it's really important and you hand carry the work through the process. Okay? Turns out this is, for the reasons I've cited, wildly inefficient. And as I said earlier, because everything's so chaotic and there's so much work, your ability to redirect in terms of changing conditions basically goes to zero in that context, right? And so this, is basically just a recipe for kind of endless organizational firefighting and chaos, okay? Which is exactly what Broad experienced. Okay? So what's the alternative? Well, if you're a manufacturing person, you already know the answer to this, but it turns out it's equally, if not more effective in the world of knowledge work. And the alternative is something we call pull. And pull has basically two core ideas. Okay? Number one is that we are not going to let those piles accumulate infinitely at each step in the process. We are going to restrict the amount of work in the system. Okay? And so if you were to go to Broad, right, and this is what it looks like today, rather than just having piles of samples around the lab, they actually, in between each step, have a really simple system of sort of color-coded cardboard boxes, and they restrict the amount of work that is allowed to flow through the system. Okay? And it turns out that when you do this, it provides really useful signals as to where the trouble is, right? So if you look at the box on the right, the person on the right, their pull box is full, they're doing fine. The person on the left, right, they can continue working for quite a while because they can continue to work until their pull box is full. Right? And it turns out that by restricting the amount of work that we allow in the system, it becomes much easier to see who's ahead and who's behind. So the person on the right here, they're definitely a little bit ahead. Their pull box is full. Person on the left, they might be a little behind. Okay, so maybe person A is going to help out person B, and we're going to get some balancing there. Okay? And then the second rule of pull is we are only, and this is the hard one, right, is we're only going to prioritize once. Okay? So if you see that pile at the front of the process on the left, when they implemented pull at the Broad, right, we told them, we said, look, that pile that stands in front of the process, you can reprioritize that to your heart's content, right? You can tell Eric Lander he can come over every day, every hour, and resequence that. We don't care, okay? However, the moment you let a sample into the process and you start working on it, hands off, don't touch it. Okay? Now, when the Broad team first implemented that, there was a little bit of pushback. You know, this is going to reduce our flexibility. We can't afford to do this, and so on and so forth. And they said, well, let's just run an experiment for 6 weeks. And if we don't like it, we will go back to the old scheme. Okay? But it turns out that if you put these two rules in place, they create an enormous amount of efficiency and flexibility. And the easiest analogy that I can give you to see why this is the case is imagine the following scenario, right? Most of you probably travel pretty regularly. If you think about it for a moment, right, when is the last time an airline, barring some major calamity, can change the passenger list on a flight? Right? And if you think about it for a second, typically in most cases, it's once that door is closed on the plane and they sort of turn the wheel and it's shut and the jetway goes back, they're not changing, right? Whoever's on the plane is going, whoever's not on the plane, they're going to have to catch the next flight. Okay? And it might not be obvious, but that rule actually creates an enormous amount of efficiency, because imagine an alternate world, right? Imagine that an airline said, well, you know, we've discovered that actually it's our, you know, high-end business travelers, basically you all, they're the ones we make the most money off of. And so maybe we should change our policy a little bit so that if a really important, you know, frequent flyer shows up and the plane is left the gate, but they haven't taken off yet, maybe we should bring the plane back, right? Because they would really appreciate the fact that, you know, we were willing to come get them and they wouldn't have to wait for the next flight, okay? Right? And it might seem like a sensible thing to do as a way of kind of appealing to your high rollers, except that, right, much like expediting, imagine the chaos it would create, right? So, you know, you're on flight 708, it gets out to the runway, the tower calls and says, hey, flight 708, I hate to do this to you, but Peter Hurst just showed up and he's a really valuable customer. Couldn't you come back and get him, right? So you come back and get Peter, he gets in his seat. But while the flight is coming back and it's going back out to the runway, more customers are showing up that are even later, and you're going to want to bring them back. And before you know it, we're never going to get anywhere, right? Because we're going to be constantly bringing the flight back to get those last few important people, and the whole system would sort of grind to a halt, right? For many of you, particularly if you live in the R&D world, this is probably roughly how your product portfolio management actually works, which is you start a project and then a more important idea shows up, and so you switch to that project, and then an even more important project shows up and you switch to that project. And as a consequence, it's very hard to get things done, right? So it turns out that if we restrict the amount of work in the system and just have the discipline to prioritize once, that can create a lot of efficiency. And that's exactly what Broad experienced. Over the course of their implementation of pull, they were able to cut their cycle time from 120 days, eventually down to about between 10 and 20 days. They were able to dramatically improve the utilization of those sequencing machines, the expensive capital equipment. You know, and they can now do, again, they were at this probably in the course of about 4 or 5 years, they were able to do stuff in 20 days and probably at least double the capacity of their lab, if not more. And if you think about it, there's a really interesting sort of little tangent to this, which is that at 120 days, gene sequencing is largely a research technology, right? It's not fast enough to really use it to treat patients. At 10 days, actually, it does become much more effective, right? So what is a core operational improvement, actually, in this case, turned out to have huge strategic implications, because once they could do things faster, it opened up an enormous new sort of opportunity for business that would not have been available to them without those operational improvements. Okay? Let me just highlight one other example. So I've been using this example from Broad in class for several years. And a few years ago, I had a cardiac surgeon as a student in our executive MBA program, Abil Manji. You can see his name on some of the papers that we wrote together. But after he saw a version of this talk, he said, you know what, I think we're actually running a push style system in my operating room. And so actually what these two papers are about is he switched in the hospital he was working at to a pull style approach where the number of beds they were have in the intensive care unit was actually going to gate the number of surgical cases that they reported. And without sort of dragging you through all the kind of gory details, they were actually able to cut about 7/10 of a day off the average length of stay for their surgical patients. They actually got better health-related outcomes as a consequence, and they saved their hospital just a couple $1 million a year by making sure that they sequence their patients appropriately. So it turns out this basic idea of pull can be applied into a variety of different places. Okay? Last little bit, and then I want to give you the trick. So how do we use pull for knowledge work? Well, this is a sort of main focus of the course, which is in the course, we introduce you to something called visual management. And the basic idea behind visual management is we want to take the knowledge work you do that's trapped in your email inboxes and to-do lists, and we're going to give it a very simple visual manifestation, right? Pre-COVID, we tended to use Post-its and markers. Now there's a variety of different sort of software pieces that are out there. But the basic idea of visual management is if we can see the work that we do and we can see all the work that you have in front of you, it turns out to be much easier to manage it. And it's pretty easy to implement a sort of pull inspired method of managing it when you have some kind of visual representation of all the work that you have in front of you. And so the photo on the lower right there, Broad also uses visual management and runs a pull style approach for managing their R&D effort as well. And again, it's been enormously successful, probably at least a threefold improvement in their productivity. Okay. And here's another example of a visual representation. This is another kind of pipeline. And each of those Post-its represents just a piece of work. And now, as we can see the work flowing through the system, we can assess how much work is there, and we can begin to kind of start to purge the system of the kind of expediting that we had talked about earlier. Okay. All right, so I want to get to questions. So here's the last trick that I want to give you, and then I'll spend the rest of the time trying to respond to your queries. If you take our class, again, as I said, we'll give you a variety of tools and techniques to put these ideas into place. But here is a trick that we have used that if you're going to do one thing to think about managing overload, we have incredibly good luck with. And the basic idea is super simple, which is for any team that you might be working with that has important stuff to do, the trick is to create what we call a common backlog. Okay. And what we mean by this is I'm sure on any team that you're available, that you're working with, everyone's got a to-do list, right? They got a whole bunch of tasks they got to get done. And each time you have a team meeting, you're all kind of assigning who's going to do what, who's going to do where. And each of those items goes on private to-do lists, right? On your phone or a piece of paper, whatever. To begin to sort of control overload and implement this pull idea, what we've had really good luck with is just have that team create a common backlog. Meaning for the team, just a common to-do list, okay? So, what does the team need to get done this week or this month in order to be successful? What are the key ideas, right? So get those in some visual format. It can be a spreadsheet, it can be on the whiteboard, other more sophisticated technology. And then to really make the common backlog technique work for you, what you want to do is have the discipline, and this is the hard part, to prioritize those, to hard rank them. Here's the most important one. Here's number 2. Here's number 3. Here's number 4. And then with that, if you can have a common backlog, sorry about that. If you can have a common backlog, right, then you can organize your meetings around what are the things that we need to do jointly to get that item off the backlog, right? This is the most important thing that we need to get done this week. How do we get it done and move it forward, right? And this seems like a simple idea, and yet we have had such good luck with that because it turns out that if teams don't have that common list of priorities, right, despite their best efforts, they're often working across priorities, right? I'm working at task A, you're working at task B, someone else is working at task C. We're not focused on the flow of our joint work. And just having it in a common to-do list, having the discipline to hard rank and then organize the meetings around how do we get the first thing done? How do we get the second thing done? How can we move those things off faster? Has, again, in many implementations at this point, been enormously helpful. Okay. So with that, there are lots of papers on this stuff, which we can make available to you that we'll talk a lot about in the class. As Peter said, the Lords of Publishing willing, I will have a book that's going to discuss all this stuff in about a year from now. And then with that, and here's some of the courses that are coming up. I'm happy to take questions. So Peter, if you can help me a little bit with the questions, that would be super.
Sure. Thanks very much, Nelson. This is really, really great. And one of the questions that came in, just going back to the origins of dynamic work design, was curiosity about how this system that you're describing relates to things like Six Sigma and Lean and Agile methodologies that people are familiar with from manufacturing and from the IT world.
Yeah, so fabulous question, and I'm really glad that came up, and I should have alluded to that earlier, which is there's a very interesting twist in all of this, which I didn't mention earlier, which is we are certainly not the first people to recognize that you need a more dynamic approach. And so almost all organizations have pockets where they manage the dynamism of their world quite well. And there are several industry-specific techniques that I think are premised on a more dynamic world. So Agile, I think, is a fabulous example. And Agile is really an example of that sort of pull-style system that we've talked about before, and it uses a couple dynamic work design principles. So Agile is an excellent manifestation of a more dynamic approach that is sort of more iterative and based on discovery. So I think there's pockets of this idea in many of the other techniques. Same is true for Toyota Production System or Lean. So, we do not profess to have invented all of these. What we've tried to do is take all these techniques that might be specific to a factory or to software or whatever, create a more general set of principles so that you can apply them in different places. And there's a really good news here, which is because most organizations have pockets where they already do this well, it gives them kind of that first foothold or stair step to leverage it into propagating that dynamic process more towards other parts of the organization. So if you're familiar with Agile or TPS, you will definitely see elements of that in our stuff. And then the other thing I would say too is the other place that organizations tend to manage dynamics very well actually turns out to be in crises, right? I've spent a lot of time studying organizational crises, industrial accidents, and so on. And there's a really weird twist in that, which is that when an organization has a crisis, they often become remarkably functional, right? So they have clear targets, they manage a common backlog, they meet on a better frequency, they get a lot of work done. And then when the crisis is resolved, they go back to all the silly stuff they did before, right? So another way of thinking about dynamic work design is how can we get all the functionality associated with crisis without really having to screw something up first, right? So that we get all the good things that happen without having to have, kind of this bad thing to catalyze it. So yeah, you'll see elements of a lot of different techniques in there. I sometimes think of dynamic work design as sort of a Rosetta Stone that will help you see the commonality of across a bunch of different techniques that you might be familiar with. It's a great question.
Maybe you could say, but just build on that a little bit. One of the other questions was, well, how do we get people to commit to these kinds of changes? And one of your famous sort of papers from the past spoke about, no one gets credit for things running smoothly in most organizations. And so how does that actually manifest in your experience?
So it's a great question. And the title of that paper was actually "No One Ever Gets Credit for Defects That Never Happened." And I cannot take credit for coming up with it. That actually came from a person I interviewed in a research study. But I do think it highlights a really core problem for organizations, particularly for any of you that are in roles that require a focus on prevention, right? So if you're doing safety or quality improvement or bug prevention, right? If you do your job well, nothing happens, right? And so it's very hard to kind of get credit for that. And so as an example, in the safety world, this is a place I've worked quite a bit, is that often an organization will have a big accident. They'll put a huge amount of time into safety. They'll get a lot better at it. And then nothing happens because they've been investing in safety. And then over time, the commitment to that safety will start to erode until there's another big incident, then the cycle will kind of repeat itself. And so we think about that in two ways, right? Number one, particularly for those kind of prevention sorts of investments, there's a variety of little tricks that you can use to make the gains you're making more salient. And I'll just give you one of those. In the safety world, and there are analogs in other places, one of the things you can do is start tracking near misses or other places where you almost had an incident as a way of getting more data on your performance. And one industry that does this enormously well is aviation, commercial aviation, which is, thank God, the number of incidents they have are vanishingly small, recent history notwithstanding. but they track near misses incredibly carefully. So they get two planes, within a couple miles of each other in the wrong place, that actually counts as something that is investigated. But as long as they see the number of near misses going down, and in fact, they've expanded the definition of them over the years, then they know they're headed in the right direction. More generally, the change approach that you will get in our class is very incremental, which is not t-shirts and coffee mugs, we're going to change everything at once. We'll focus you on pick one problem that's really creating chaos. Let's go solve that. And solving that problem will create a little momentum, give you some confidence you're headed in the right direction, and move on to the next one. And so, if you want maybe an overused metaphor, it's really more like making a lifestyle change than going on a diet, right? Which is, we're going to sort of fundamentally change the way that you think about your role and your job, and ongoing problem solving will be a sort of core part of that. And those of you that are, familiar with Toyota Production System or its variants, right, that's kind of a core ethos of that system as well. So it will feel fairly familiar to you in this context.
Great. And a couple of questions about the link between these more efficient work processes and what you started out by saying, which was that this is the need to be able to respond to dynamic situations in real time. So could you perhaps just go over again, maybe a little bit more depth, what that connection is? Is it just that the efficiency improvement is creating slack, and it's the slack that you need to respond to other situations, or is there something else that's important from that sort of dynamic position?
Yeah, so that's such a great question. And there is a line of research in kind of both management scholarship and kind of more popular management journals, which basically boils down to you should be careful about over-investing in efficiency because it will harden your organizational arteries and make you sort of more prone to disruption, right? So if you're the, world's best buggy whip manufacturer or analog film manufacturer, right, the very fact that you're so efficient will make it hard for you to spot the next change on the horizon. I disagree with that at a very foundational level, and I won't sort of drag you through all the details. But to say that one of the side effects of being more efficient is that in most cases your core processes are going to be far faster. And with that improved speed, whether it's cycle time or product development or customer acquisition or whatever, as your processes get faster, it gives you the ability to redirect to new strategic opportunities far more quickly. So to give you an example, our friends at Broad used to plan their R&D portfolio like everybody else on an annual basis, right? Now, thanks to a lot of improvements and changes in the planning process and visual management, they now do it on a quarterly basis, right? So a year-long project is now sort of 4 quarterly long projects. But what that means is they have basically taken that review cadence, so that redirection cadence, and cut it by about a factor of 4, right? So if we are kind of resetting every quarter, it allows us to react to changes in the environment sort of far more quickly than we would have been otherwise. And to give you another example, I went through it quickly in the interest of time, but if you go back to the project I quickly alluded to about moving patients through the hospital, and this is one of the kind of hardest things to get your head around when you use pull, is that when you put a pull system in place, it feels like you are restricting your ability to adjust, right? Because I can only reprioritize projects at the beginning of the process. Once I put in the process, I have to get out of the way. But in fact, our experience is that when you put a pull system in, the cycle time gains you get are so big, the process is so much faster that you actually have an increased ability to redirect rather than a decreased ability. And I get that's a little counterintuitive. That's probably the biggest sort of brain meld that happens in my class, is getting people to kind of understand how that actually happens. So our experience has been, if you do it right, you take this fundamentally dynamic approach, the processes you will get are so much faster and the cadence is so much more regular that you actually have a dramatically increased ability to redirect your resources to new strategic opportunities. And you don't have to work around the system. You get to do it within the system rather than outside of it.
Great. So paraphrasing a few other questions here. So I mentioned your study of leadership as a phenomenon as well. What is the role, positive and negative, in these kinds of systems of leaders and leadership? And there are a lot of questions about how do you actually implement this, and who takes the initiative, and if it's political, what's your advice on how to deal with that?
Yeah, so it's a fabulous question. And to give you a 30-second sort of history of how I ended up in leadership, I actually grew up in a scholarly tradition that tended to minimize the impact of leaders on organizations. It's a very what's called structural approach. But as I continued to work out in the real world, right, it became inescapable that actually leaders made an enormous difference on their organizations, and that the scholarship was just sort of wrong in that regard. And so that's one of the reasons that I have sort of gravitated towards that area. I think the connection between that and dynamic work design is number one, again, we will very much be against the kind of t-shirt and coffee model of change. And we're going to talk a lot about how, for leaders at any level, to sort of start this process, it really requires them often to begin to get their hands a little dirty. So when I do my student projects with my executive MBA students, I always tell them on the first day, this project is going to require you to work a little bit below your pay grade when you get started, right? And they always chafe at that. Well, I'm a senior executive and so on and so forth. But what's going on there is in most cases, senior executives actually have very little idea what's happening in their organizations on a day-to-day basis. And therefore, because of that, they make decisions that make the daily operations worse in material ways. And so we will start by having senior executives do projects, sort of metaphorically speaking, closer to the shop floor. We do that not because we necessarily need their expertise, but because they will learn a lot about how their organization actually works. And with that knowledge, they will then be able to execute their job far more effectively. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to be solving problems on the shop floor sort of day in and day out for the rest of their careers. They will return back to their level. But I tend to think of the change process and the leadership process as kind of concentric circles, right? We're going to start with a small problem. We're going to solve that. If we can make progress, we'll move to the next one and the next one. And that, in some sense, kind of retrains leaders and helps them build sort of street cred with the folks who are doing the work in terms of their ability to kind of lead it and move forward. So it will transform your role as a leader in a pretty significant way. But we have found it's an enormously powerful method for leaders to really get a much better sense of what's actually happening on the ground in their organizations, which I think, at least in my experience, is something that's often in a little bit short supply.
Great. And I think we've got time for one last kind of meta question, which is, so if people are keen to figure out how to get started on something, is there any particular preference for a visual management tool or an approach? There are, a lot of, if we Google it, there's a lot of different sort of approaches out there. Do you have any tips for what people should really?
Yeah, so it's a super question. And I would say pre-COVID, the advice I gave when this question came up is, start with pencil and paper, Post-its and markers. Not because I think the software is bad. I just think it's, when you use digital tools, it's all too easy to get kind of focused on the bells and whistles of the digital tool and lose the sort of core meaning, which is we want to be able to see the work move through the system or see it when it's not moving through the system. Now, obviously, as we're in a more remote environment, I would say that is not always feasible. So I think I have two pieces of advice, which is start simple. Don't try to map how the work moves through, entire organization. Just think about your team or the backlog of work in your little area. And then I would also say use the simplest tool that you can get away with digitally. Trello is something that many of you are probably familiar with. I have no connection to them, but you can learn how to use it in about 30 seconds. It's not super flexible in terms of different maps, but it's often a good starter. And in fact, Zoom now has some pretty nice functionality in terms of kind of making little cards or Post-it notes or whatever. But here's the most important point of all this, and probably a good place to finish in the interest of time. The magic of visual management is not the Post-its or the digital cards. It is the conversation that you and your team have in front of the board about why the work is moving and not moving. That's the key, right? And so the danger of the digital tools is ultimately, if people start to say, well, I'm not going to come to the meeting, I'll just check the board later, then you've lost it. Right? It's the human connection and the human kind of problem solving that happens when we look at a common backlog or a common process map or whatever that really creates the benefit. And so anything that causes you to have better conversations about directing your resources as a team is probably a plus. If people are using the digital tools to not come to the meetings, then you've probably lost it.
Great, thank you. On that note, keep it simple and start doing it seem to be the two watchwords there. Thank you, Professor Nelson Repenning, for sharing your insights on this work, and thank you all for joining us from all around the world. And as Nelson mentioned several times, if you're interested in really taking a deep dive into this topic with Nelson, there's a couple of options coming up. Visual Management for Competitive Advantage is a live online on Zoom version of this course, and we also have a self-paced online one starting a little sooner, February the 14th, the next cohort of that. Thank you again for joining us from all around the world. Thank you, Nelson, for sharing your insights, and we'll look forward to seeing folks in our next Innovation at Work webinar.
Thanks, everyone.